The day I found out Marcus had been stealing from people who had lost everything, I was sitting at my desk holding a promotion letter with my name on it. Same afternoon, same hour almost. The universe has a way of doing that, dropping good news and something devastating into the same moment, like it wants to see which one you reach for first. My brother Daniel called me around 5 in the evening. I remember because the light was doing that thing it does late in the day, coming through the window at an angle that makes everything look warmer than it actually is. His voice was flat, not upset, not angry, just flat. The way people sound when they have already spent all their emotion getting ready to say something, and there is nothing left by the time the words actually come out. He told me slowly, carefully, like he was placing something fragile on a table and did not want it to break before I had a chance to see it properly. Marcus had been taking money from the community fund. Not a little. Not once. For close to 2 years, he had been quietly pulling from the account that our neighborhood had built together after the fire. That fire. The one that took out half the block on a dry Wednesday night and left people standing on the pavement at 2 in the morning watching everything they owned turn into smoke and ash. I was one of those people. I stood there in a coat I had grabbed on the way out and watched my neighbor Claire try to hold herself together while her back porch collapsed inward like a slow exhale. We built that fund from scratch. Bake sales and direct transfers and people showing up with envelopes of cash because they did not know what else to do, but wanted to do something. It was not a fortune, but it was ours, built out of nothing but the stubborn belief that we could pull each other back up. And Marcus had been quietly helping himself to it for 2 years. I did not say anything when Daniel finished. I just sat there with the phone against my ear, looking at my coffee going cold on the counter, feeling something settle inside me that was not quite anger. It was stiller than anger, heavier, like a door closing in a room where the windows are already shut. Daniel asked if I was still there. I said yes. He asked what I was thinking. I told him I was not sure yet. That was not entirely true. What I was thinking was simple. Someone had looked at people in their worst moment, people who had trusted him with something they could not afford to lose, and had decided that their loss was his opportunity. And nothing had happened to him. He was still showing up to meetings, still shaking hands, still accepting thank yous with that steady, reliable expression he wore like a second face. And I was sitting here holding a promotion letter, while Daniel's voice was telling me the world had been quietly broken for 2 years without any of us knowing. The stillness inside me was not shock. I want to be clear about that. It was recognition. The particular feeling of understanding something completely, all at once, with no part of you left over to pretend otherwise. I knew in that moment that I was going to do something. I did not know the shape of it yet, but I knew it was already decided. If this story is hitting close to home, stay with it. And if you believe people like Marcus should not get to walk away clean, subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more than you know. My brother Daniel is not someone who panics. That matters because when he first noticed the gaps in the fund's records, his instinct was not to sound the alarm. It was to recount, then recount again. He sat with those numbers the way you sit with something that does not make sense, turning it over quietly, looking for the angle where it resolves into something innocent. He told me later he almost convinced himself it was a data entry error, a rounding issue. The kind of small administrative mess that happens when volunteers are managing spreadsheets on kitchen tables after long workdays. That is exactly what Marcus had counted on. Not that no one would look, but that decent people, when they look and see something uncomfortable, will work very hard to find a reason not to believe it. Daniel is one of the most decent people I know. He spent 3 weeks giving Marcus the benefit of a doubt that Marcus had never earned. During those 3 weeks, Daniel kept showing up to help with deliveries and logistics, standing next to Marcus at distribution events, watching him talk to families with that warm, unhurried manner he had. Marcus had a gift for making people feel seen. He remembered names, asked follow-up questions, never seemed rushed. The families loved him. The board trusted him. He had built exactly the kind of reputation that makes accusation feel like an attack on something good, which was, I now understood, the whole architecture of it. When Daniel finally told me, I asked him straight out why it had taken him 3 weeks. He looked at the floor for a moment, the way he does when he is choosing his words carefully, and then he said something that stayed with me. He said he knew what I would do once I knew, and he had not been sure he was ready for that. I did not push him on what he meant. I understood it. Daniel had wanted to protect something: the fund, the community, the idea that Marcus was who he appeared to be, for just a little longer. Because once I was involved, that particular comfort was going to end. What I want you to understand about Daniel is that he is not weak. He is careful. There is a difference that most people get wrong. Weak people avoid the truth because they are afraid of it. Careful people avoid it because they understand the weight of what comes after. Daniel knew exactly what the truth would cost once it was out in the open, and he had needed a few weeks to decide he was willing to pay it. I respected that, even as I picked up the folder he had brought me and started reading through every page. The numbers were quiet and methodical and absolutely damning. And somewhere underneath the columns and the dates and the small, precise gaps, I could feel the shape of a person who had calculated, very carefully, exactly how much he could take before anyone would notice. The thing that nobody tells you about betrayal is that the hardest part is not the moment you find out. The hardest part is the morning after, when you wake up and have to go back into the world and look at the person who did it and act like everything is still normal. I did that for 11 days straight. I made a decision the night Daniel left my apartment. I sat at the kitchen table with his folder open in front of me, the pages spread out under the overhead light, and I told myself something very clearly. I was not going to rush this. I was not going to walk up to Marcus at the next community meeting and confront him in front of everyone and let him use my emotion as a shield. Because that is what people like Marcus do. They are very good at making the person who catches them look like the problem. The louder you are, the easier it is for them to reframe everything, to say you misunderstood, to perform confusion so convincingly that the room starts looking at you instead of at them. I had seen it happen before, in smaller situations, with smaller stakes. I was not going to hand him that exit. So I volunteered. I sent Marcus a message that same evening, casual and friendly, telling him I had some free time and wanted to help out at the next distribution event. He replied within 20 minutes, warm, grateful, exactly the way he always was. He said something like, "We could really use the extra hands. Come early if you can." I stared at that message for a long time. The ease of it, the complete, untroubled ease of a man who had no idea the ground had already shifted under him. I showed up early the following Saturday. The community hall smelled the way it always did on distribution days, like old wood and someone's casserole warming in the back kitchen. The particular combination of practical and neighborly that made the place feel lived in. Marcus was already there, setting up folding tables with the relaxed efficiency of someone completely at home in the role he had built for himself. He smiled when he saw me and handed me a stack of printed sign-in sheets without missing a beat. I smiled back. I took the sheets. My hands were completely steady. I was surprised by that, how steady they were. What I was actually doing while I handed out forms and directed people to the right tables was watching. Not him exactly, though I watched him too. I was watching the whole system he had constructed, the way information moved through the room, who knew what and who got told what, and who was kept slightly outside the loop without ever quite realizing it. Marcus had positioned himself at the center of every decision, but in a way that looked like generosity rather than control. He was always the one who knew which families were still waiting. Always the one who could tell you the status of a particular reimbursement. Everyone came to him because he had made himself the only person who had the full picture. And the full picture, I was now understanding, was something he curated very deliberately. By the end of that morning, I had confirmed something Daniel had suspected, but could not quite prove from the paperwork alone. Marcus was not just taking money. He was managing perception. He knew exactly which families were likely to follow up, and which ones would accept a delay without pushing back. Claire was in the second category, or so he thought. Patient, exhausted, inclined to apologize for asking too many questions. He had read her correctly as someone who would wait. What he had not accounted for was someone reading him. The Saturday after that, I sat next to Claire at the end of the meeting. She was gathering her things slowly, the way people do when they are tired but not quite ready to go home to an empty house. The back porch on her place was still exposed to the weather. She had put up a temporary covering herself, some thick plastic sheeting she had found, held down with bricks at the corners. She mentioned it the way people mention things they have gotten used to carrying alone, briefly, without complaint, like it was just a fact of the landscape now. I asked her how long the reimbursement had been sitting in processing. She paused, thought about it, said it had been just over 4 months. She said Marcus had told her it was a backlog issue, that everyone was waiting on the same thing. I nodded slowly. I asked if she had kept her receipts and her documentation. She looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who has been careful because they learned a long time ago that being careful was the only protection they had. She said she had everything, every single page, organized by date in a binder at home. Something inside me settled another degree. This was going to work. What I had not expected was what Claire said next, quietly, almost as an afterthought as she pulled on her coat. She said she had heard from another family, the Kellermans, that their reimbursement had apparently been processed and sent months ago, but they had never received anything. And when they moved away shortly after, they had assumed it had gotten lost in the transition. Nobody had followed up. Nobody had looked twice. I felt the temperature in my chest drop about 10 degrees, because that was not a gap in a spreadsheet anymore. That had a name on it. Marcus had stolen money from a family that no longer even lived there to complain about it. That was the part that kept me up that night, not the spreadsheets, not the gaps in the numbers, but the sheer calculation of it. He had chosen the Kellermans specifically because they were leaving. Because a family in transition is a family too overwhelmed to audit anything. Because grief and displacement and the chaos of starting over somewhere new meant they would probably assume the money had gotten lost in the shuffle and eventually stop asking. He had not just stolen from them. He had studied them first and decided they were safe to steal from. I drove home from the community hall that evening with Claire's words sitting in my chest like something cold and heavy. The streets were quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens on Saturday evenings when the week has finally emptied out and everyone is somewhere warm and indoors. I had the window cracked slightly, and the air coming in smelled like rain that had not arrived yet. That particular charged smell that makes the world feel like it is holding its breath. I felt like I was holding mine, too. When I got home, I opened Daniel's folder again and went through every page with fresh eyes, not looking for the gaps this time, looking for the pattern underneath them. And there it was, so clean it was almost elegant in the worst possible way. Every missing or redirected payment had one thing in common. The families involved had all been in some kind of transition at the time. Moving, dealing with a health issue, a job change, something that pulled their attention away from the fund and toward their own immediate survival. Marcus had not been random. He had been patient and selective, and he had waited until people were looking the other way before he moved. That was not desperation. That was a system. I spent the next several evenings building my own system in response. I cleared the dining room table completely, which is something I almost never do because that table tends to collect everything. Mail and keys and the things you put down meaning to deal with them later. I wiped it clean and spread everything out. Daniel's records on the left, the official fund documents I had requested access to as a new volunteer on the right, Claire's receipts, which she had dropped off in a neat plastic folder the day after our conversation, in the middle. And then I started cross-referencing, line by line, date by date, name by name. I am not an accountant. I want to be honest about that. But I have been running my own small business for 6 years, and what that teaches you, more than anything else, is how to read the story that numbers are telling, even when someone has tried to make that story boring enough to ignore. Marcus had made his version of the numbers very boring on purpose. Small amounts moved at irregular intervals, nothing that would trigger alarm on its own. Everything labeled with just enough legitimate-sounding description to pass a casual glance. But when you laid it all out together, when you stopped looking at each entry as a separate event and started seeing the whole shape of it, something else appeared entirely. By the end of the third evening, I had a document of my own, 12 pages, every discrepancy listed in plain language with the corresponding source documents attached. I had cross-referenced the Kellerman's supposed disbursement date against the fund's actual bank activity for that period and found something Marcus had clearly not expected anyone to find. The outgoing transfer existed, the amount matched, but the destination account number was different from the one on file for the Kellermans by a single digit. 1 digit. The kind of difference that looks like a typo until you realize that the account it actually went to had been opened just 3 weeks before that transfer and closed 6 weeks after it. I sat back in my chair and looked at that for a long time. The room was very quiet. The only sound was the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, and somewhere outside, a car moving slowly down the wet street. I printed everything twice before I went to bed. One copy went into a folder in my filing cabinet under a tab I labeled with something generic enough that it would not catch anyone's eye if they happened to look. The other copy I drove to Daniel's apartment the next morning and handed to him without saying much. He sat at his kitchen table and read through it slowly, turning each page carefully like he was handling something that might not survive rough treatment. When he finished, he looked up at me and said something I had not expected. He said he was sorry it had taken him 3 weeks to tell me. I shook my head. I told him the 3 weeks had not cost us anything. Because Marcus had not been planning to stop on his own. He had been planning to keep going for as long as no one looked carefully enough to catch him. And now someone had. What I had not told Daniel yet was the part that was still keeping me up at night. Because 12 pages of documentation and a folder full of receipts was not the same as accountability. It was evidence. And evidence sitting in a filing cabinet changes nothing. The real question was what happened next, and more specifically, who needed to be in the room when it did. There were 5 people on the oversight board, and I knew for a fact that one of them had been signing off on monthly summaries without reading them. I knew because I had watched him do it at a meeting 3 weeks earlier, flipping through the pages Marcus handed him while carrying on a conversation about something completely unrelated, initialing each sheet with the casual ease of someone who had been trusting the same person for so long that the act of checking had stopped feeling necessary. His name was Gerald, and he was not a bad man. He was a tired man who had made the very human mistake of confusing familiarity with safety. That was the thing I had to sit with before I made my next move. Because walking into a room and accusing someone is easy. Walking into a room with 12 pages of documentation and making sure the right people understand what they are looking at, that is something else entirely. It requires knowing your audience. It requires understanding not just what the truth is, but what it will cost each person in that room to accept it. And some of those costs are higher than others. I spent 2 days thinking about who to call and in what order. Not because I was uncertain about what the documents showed. I was not uncertain about that at all. But because the sequence mattered. If I went to the wrong person first, someone who would immediately call Marcus out of habit or loyalty or simple panic, the whole thing would collapse before it had a chance to land properly. Marcus would have time to prepare a story, and a prepared story from someone as practiced as him could do a lot of damage to 12 pages of careful work. I called the board chair first. Her name was Patricia, and she was the kind of person who had earned her position through decades of showing up when things were hard rather than only when things were easy. She was in her 60s, calm in the way that comes from having already navigated several versions of the worst thing imaginable, and she had a reputation in the neighborhood for being genuinely fair, which is rarer than people admit. I asked her to meet me for coffee. I did not tell her why. She said yes without asking, which told me she had already noticed something was not right, even if she had not yet let herself name it. We met at a small place 2 streets over from the community hall. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and a counter that had been there so long it had its own particular smell. Old wood and strong coffee, and something faintly sweet from the pastries in the glass case. I got there early. I had the folder on the table in front of me when she walked in, and I watched her eyes go to it immediately, the way experienced people's eyes go to the thing in the room that carries weight. She sat down, ordered nothing, and looked at me steadily. I pushed the folder across the table without preamble. She opened it, She read slowly and carefully, the way she did everything. And the only sign that anything was affecting her was a single small movement, her jaw tightening just slightly around page 4 when she got to the Kellermans. She finished every page before she said a single word. Then she closed the folder and put both hands flat on top of it and looked out the window for a moment. When she looked back at me, she said, quietly and without any drama at all, that she needed to make some calls. I told her I only had one condition. Marcus could not know until everyone was in the room. She nodded once. She understood exactly why. What happened over the next 4 days, I was not directly part of. Patricia moved through it with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, contacting each board member individually, sharing enough to bring them in without creating a panic, keeping the circle tight and the timeline short. She called me on the 4th evening to tell me it was arranged, a meeting the following Tuesday at the community hall after hours, all 5 board members. Claire, at my specific request, because she deserved to be in that room, and one other person, which Patricia mentioned almost as an afterthought at the end of the call, in a tone that told me it was anything but an afterthought. She had reached out to the Kellermans. I did not sleep well the night before the meeting. Not from doubt, I want to be clear about that. The documentation was solid, the pattern was undeniable. What kept me awake was something different, the particular weight of knowing that tomorrow, something that had been quietly true for 2 years was going to become publicly, permanently, unavoidably real. And that once that happened, there was no version of this neighborhood that looked the way it had looked the week before Daniel called me. Some things, once they are seen clearly, change the shape of everything around them. I lay in the dark and thought about Claire's plastic sheeting, held down with bricks, and the Kellermans starting over somewhere new without the money they had been counting on, and Daniel sitting at his kitchen table, reading through 12 pages with that careful, deliberate attention he gave to things that mattered. And then I got up, made coffee, and waited for morning. The community hall looked different after hours. I had been inside it dozens of times, but always during the day, always full of movement and voices, and the particular organized chaos of people trying to help each other. At night, with just the overhead lights on and the chairs arranged in a loose circle near the front, it felt larger and quieter than it actually was. The smell was the same, old wood and something faintly like the casseroles from the last distribution day. But without the warmth of bodies and conversation, it sat differently in the air. Patricia was already there when I arrived, standing near the window with a cup of tea going cold in her hand. She gave me a nod that said everything was in place. I set my copy of the folder on the nearest chair and looked toward the door. We had asked Marcus to come at 7, 15 minutes after everyone else. He did not know that yet. Marcus walked into that room smiling. That is the detail I keep coming back to, even now. He walked in at 7 o'clock exactly, coat still on, a paper cup of coffee in one hand, and he was smiling the way he always smiled, easy and warm and slightly ahead of the room, like a man arriving at something he expected to run. He saw the circle of chairs. He saw the folders on every seat. He saw Patricia standing at the front rather than sitting. And for just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that he did not quite manage to control. It was not guilt. It was the very specific expression of someone who has just realized that the room they walked into is not the room they thought they were walking into. Then it was gone, replaced immediately by the same steady warmth, and he said hello to everyone like nothing had shifted at all. Patricia asked him to sit down. He did, choosing the chair closest to the door without seeming to think about it, which I noticed, and which told me that even in that first moment, some part of him was already calculating exits. She waited until he had settled before she spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not begin with an accusation. She simply said that the board had been reviewing the fund's financial records and had identified some areas that needed clarification, and that she hoped he could help them understand what they were looking at. She nodded to me. I had asked to be the one to walk through the documents. Not because I needed the credit, but because I had built the picture, and I knew every line of it, and there was no room for any gap or stumble in the presentation. I stood up and took them through it slowly, the same way I had with Patricia in the coffee shop, page by page, letting each item land before moving to the next. The room was very quiet. The only sounds were the occasional shift of someone in their chair and the faint hum of the overhead lights, and at one point, Claire drawing a breath so quietly it was almost not a sound at all. Marcus interrupted twice in the first few minutes. Both times with the same instinct, a smooth, reasonable-sounding alternative explanation delivered in a tone that suggested he was trying to be helpful rather than defensive. The first time I let him finish, and then simply showed him the corresponding bank document that made his explanation impossible. The second time, Patricia put her hand up slightly, just a small gesture, and he stopped mid-sentence. After that, he did not interrupt again. He sat very still with the paper coffee cup in his hands, and he listened. And I watched him make the internal calculation that people in his position always make at some point. The moment when they shift from trying to reframe the story to trying to figure out how much damage has already been done. When I got to the Kellerman section of the documents, the room changed. I cannot describe it any other way. It was not that anyone moved or spoke. It was something in the air, a collective stillness that was different from the stillness before, heavier and less patient. I put the page with the account number discrepancy on the table, face up, where everyone could see it clearly. The one-digit difference. The account opened 3 weeks before the transfer and closed 6 weeks after. I did not editorialize. I did not need to. Gerald, who had been sitting with his hands folded in his lap since the beginning, leaned forward and looked at that page for a long time without saying anything. Then he sat back and looked at Marcus directly. It was the first time all evening that Gerald had looked at him directly. Marcus did not look back. Patricia spoke then. She said, still in that same measured tone, that the board would need a full written explanation of every transaction in question within 48 hours. She said that pending that explanation, Marcus's access to all fund accounts and records was suspended effective immediately. She said the matter was being referred for independent review. She said all of this the way you say things when you have already made the decision, and the meeting is not a negotiation, but a notification. Marcus set his coffee cup down on the floor beside his chair. It was such a small, ordinary gesture, but it hit me as one of the most telling things I had ever watched anyone do, because it was the gesture of a man who needed his hands free, who had run out of things to hold on to. He said one thing before he left. Not an explanation, not an apology. He looked around the circle of chairs and said that he had done a lot of good for this community. Patricia agreed that he had. Then she told him that it did not balance the ledger. He stood up, picked up his coat, and walked out. The door did not slam. It closed quietly behind him, which was somehow worse. The room stayed silent for a moment after he left. Then Claire made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a cry, but something in between. The sound of someone who has been holding tension in their body for so long that the release of it does not feel like relief. Not immediately. It just feels like a sudden and overwhelming awareness of how tired they are. I sat back down in my chair and looked at the folder in my lap, and felt something unclench in my chest that I had not even fully registered was clenched. Gerald was the first to speak. He said he owed everyone in that room an apology. That he had been signing those summaries without reading them properly for over a year. That he had trusted a familiar face more than he had trusted his own responsibility. Patricia said that accountability was not just Marcus's to carry tonight. Gerald nodded. He looked like a man who had just added something real and permanent to the list of things he would not do again. That mattered too. The formal process took several weeks. The independent review confirmed everything in the 12 pages and found 2 additional discrepancies I had not caught. A repayment plan was established. The matter was reported to the relevant authorities, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a simple, necessary step. Because documentation sitting in a room full of people who have agreed to keep it quiet is not accountability. It is just a more organized version of looking the other way. Claire received her reimbursement before the review was even completed, because Patricia pushed for it personally, and because some things should not have to wait for the formal process to finish. The Kellermans were contacted by phone. I was not part of that conversation, but Daniel told me afterward that they had gone quiet for a long time when they understood what had happened, and then the person on the other end had said something simple, that they had always thought there was something wrong, but had not known who to tell. They had just assumed no one would listen. That stayed with me more than almost anything else about the whole situation. Not the documents, not the meeting, not Marcus's face when he realized the room had already decided. The idea that 2 people had sensed something wrong and quietly concluded that saying so would not matter. That is what happens when trust is used as a tool against the people who extend it. It does not just take their money or their time or their energy. It takes their confidence that speaking up will change anything at all. And that particular kind of damage is the hardest to repair, because you cannot fix it with a repayment plan or a board resolution. You fix it one honest conversation at a time, by showing people, slowly and repeatedly, that the room will actually listen. Daniel came by the evening after the review findings were released. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had spread out all those documents weeks earlier, now clean and empty, and had coffee and did not talk about Marcus at all. We talked about the fund, about what changes the board was putting in place, about the new oversight structure Patricia had proposed, where no single person controlled the information flow anymore, about Claire, who had finally started getting quotes for a proper back porch, about small things becoming real again after a long time of being stalled. At one point, Daniel said, quietly and without much ceremony, that he was glad he had called me that Tuesday evening. I told him I was glad he had too. We finished our coffee. Outside, it had started to rain, the real kind this time, steady and unhurried, the kind that does not apologize for arriving. Here is what this whole experience taught me, and I mean this in a way that goes beyond Marcus and beyond that community fund. Trust is not a feeling. It is a structure. And like any structure, it requires maintenance, regular inspection. The willingness to look closely, even when looking closely, is uncomfortable. When we stop inspecting, not out of laziness, but out of loyalty or comfort, or the simple human desire to believe that the people we rely on deserve that reliance, we do not protect the structure. We just stop noticing when it is being quietly taken apart from the inside. The moment we decided to look, really look, everything else followed. The documents existed because the truth existed. It just needed someone to stop giving the benefit of the doubt and start paying attention instead. And here is the question I want to leave you with, because I think about it more than I expected to. If you had been in Daniel's position, if you had seen the numbers and felt that something was wrong but were not completely certain, and you knew that speaking up would set something irreversible in motion, would you have waited 3 weeks like he did? Or would you have made the call on day 1? Think about that honestly before you answer, because I think most of us believe we would act immediately. And I think most of us are not being entirely straight with ourselves when we say so. Tell me in the comments what you would actually do. I want to know. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something real, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and there are more stories like this one coming.